Hey, this is Jennifer Signieri. I am getting up here and running for Workers' Comp Talk. And let me just make sure on my computer in front of me that everything's set up. Yes, this is Jennifer Signieri, and this is Workers' Comp Talk. This is our Facebook Live series where we talk about an area of workers' compensation law. The format is always the same. The topic changes, but the format's always the same. We cover a given area of workers' comp law. You are welcome to write your questions in the comments, and I'll address them live. I am a board-certified workers' compensation specialist, so this is not my first rodeo. I can take quite a few questions. I do on a regular basis. Did today. Speak to lots of my clients, but also folks who are just calling to get some guidance. And welcome to post the comments in the questions. So during Workers' Comp Talk today, we're going to talk about COVID-19 and coverage under the Workers' Comp Act. And I'll be honest, it's kind of this area that we're still exploring, and it's something that we're trying to feel our way out on and I'll address that, and I'll address the points. But before I get into that, what I'd like to say is that today is going to be legal information. It isn't necessarily, meant to be legal advice for a particular set of facts. Let me make sure that everything is working on my audio. But if you do hear something and you want to have a longer conversation about it, you're welcome to give us a call. We do free consultations. I'll put our information on here. We do it all the time. I did one today. It's not always the case that somebody needs an attorney necessarily, but we are happy to help you figure that out, address some questions. We provide free consultations at the phone number. You can also go on our website, fill out a contact form, and we'll contact you. So that's an option. What I'd like to say is I've spoken to folks over the last couple of months who work in hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing homes, and contracted the virus. And they want to know what their options are. And so some of what I want to talk about today is about, what they can get from the workers' comp, insurance coverage, but also to talk about what that entails. What does it mean to prove it? And before I get into that, I want to say, the Workers' Comp Act is, of course, not the only only form of relief. There's something that was called the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act that was passed, federally last April, that allowed folks to get emergency paid sick leave for up to 80 hours if they got sick. Problem with that is, of course, is it only covers 80 hours. And if you have complications, that's not really going to get you very far. But also, it doesn't cover medical treatment, right? And that's where a lot of people have a lot of concerns, is that if you have complications, you're stuck in the hospital. So, and the last part about that is that law basically ended last December. So if you're getting sick this year, you're not getting covered under that law for the 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave. There is also unemployment, but again, the problem with that is it doesn't cover medical treatment. And in North Carolina, without the federal subsidy, usually you're capped at about $350 a week, which is not going to get, for a lot of us, very far. So during this episode of Workers' Comp Talk, I'm going to cover three things. I'm going to briefly recap what is, a general overview of what is an injury by accident, which we talked about at the last episode. And I'm not going to go into it in great detail because we just did cover it last week in the last live session. I encourage you to go find that. It's probably still on our Facebook Live page, and you can have a look. But then I'm going to talk about what is an occupational disease, which when we were talking about it last week, I didn't go into great detail because it could literally be its own episode, and that's part of what we're trying to do here. And then I'm going to talk about injury by accident, occupational diseases, and how does that apply to this COVID-19 context. So last week we talked about what is a covered injury by accident, or a covered injury that occurs on the job. And we talked about that usually requires an injury by accident. And again, that a worker can't simply say they were at their job, they got hurt, and voila, they have a covered injury. It's really not the case. The Workers' Compensation Act requires that you have a separate accident and a separate injury. The fact that you get hurt isn't enough to be a covered injury. The accident itself is what counts. And the accident has to be something unusual that happens on the job. It cannot be you doing your usual job. And I gave the example last week of, for instance, a package handler who goes to take a package and put it on a shelf in a delivery van. And in doing that, they feel a pull on their shoulder and they hurt it. And we talked about how that is not a covered injury by accident. They've done that 100 times. There was nothing unusual about them putting the package on the shelf. They did have an injury, but the injury itself doesn't count as an accident. But then we used the other example of, say, that same package handler who puts the package on the shelf in a delivery van and the package gets caught on something and they didn't know it, and then they feel a pull. Well, it's that caught on something, the package getting caught on something, that's the unusual event. That's not something that they normally would have been expecting as part of their job. That's the accident. That's the covered injury by accident. And so it's a very, fine detail, and the details really matter when you're deciding if a given injury fits within that legal definition of injury by accident. So we talked about that. And then, we talked about how, there's this other subset of injuries, which is occupational diseases. And we didn't go into that very much. So, and it's a bit complicated, but I'll say, that usually covers things more like the repetitive type injuries that sometimes people get, like carpal tunnel syndrome in their wrists, or epicondylitis, golfer's elbow. Occupational diseases can cover that. It also covers conditions that are actually listed out in a statute. And there's 28 of them. It includes things like asbestosis and silicosis. And I won't go into, all 28 of them, but not surprisingly, it's not, COVID-19 is not listed as one of those diseases. And so what happens under our Workers' Comp Act, if it's not listed under the statute as a covered disease, there's a different standard for proving it. If it's listed, you have to show that the employment had a significant causal factor in someone contracting that particular disease. And usually that's going to entail talking to a doctor, getting their opinion about, did it come from a different source? That's if it's actually listed in the statute. If it's not listed in the statute, and COVID-19 would be one of those, carpal would be one of these, golfer's elbow would be one of these. If it's not listed, there's going to be a higher standard. And it's harder. It is really hard. A worker in that circumstance is going to have to prove that the employment significantly contributed to, and I'm going to use air quotes here, or was a significant causal factor. This is a legal term of art, straight from the case law, in the development of their occupational disease. Essentially that's going to mean a doctor saying that that condition, was significantly brought on by the work. Usually it's going to require a doctor's opinion. And the other aspect of it, when it's not listed under the statute, is that the employment placed them at an increased risk of contracting the disease rather than from the public generally, okay? So ordinary diseases of life, where the public is exposed equally with, workers in a particular trade or occupation are going to be excluded, okay? So things like the flu, not going to be covered. So whenever I'm representing someone as a practical matter in an occupational disease claim, and a lot of this can be something like carpal tunnel syndrome. It's going to entail me, talking to their doctor, getting their opinion about whether this condition was significantly contributed to by their employment, but also talking about in really great detail about what they were physically doing day in and day out. Really getting into there about how many times they were picking up a bottle, or how many times were they, hammering away, with a particular tool, and then taking that information and bringing it to a doctor to get that opinion about whether the employment placed them at an increased risk. In terms of increased risk, it's important to know that an occupational disease can come from a single exposure. It can come from repeated activities over time, doing the same thing over and over again over the course of 9 years. It's not, again, not going to be for ordinary diseases like the flu. And we know COVID-19 is not an ordinary disease. But as a practical matter, I'm going to tell you, occupational diseases are almost always denied by the workers' compensation insurance carrier. They're denied because they're really hard to prove. They require these very high standards. And these sorts of claims absolutely require someone to retain an attorney, usually a board-certified workers' compensation specialist, because you're going to really need more than just a general knowledge of workers' compensation law to be able to win these sorts of claims. So that's just a practical tip, some practical advice. Don't go it alone when it comes to occupational disease claims. Retain an attorney, and specifically a board-certified workers' compensation specialist. So injury by accident, occupational disease, and then let's talk a little bit about how that works with COVID-19. Let me make sure I'm not missing anybody's comments. I don't think I am. So how does that work with COVID-19? Well, COVID-19 could qualify, a coronavirus infection could qualify as either an injury by accident or an occupational disease if it comes from a work-related exposure. Now, if someone is doing their usual job in their usual way, and there's another coworker who's sick with the virus and passes it on, this is probably not going to be an injury by accident. Remember, the standard for an injury by accident to be covered under the Workers' Comp Act is that there has to be something unusual that happened, and it cannot be the injury, right? It can't be getting the virus. It has to be something unusual that happened on the job. So for instance, if someone is a hospital clerk and they are short-staffed at the hospital, and then they're asked to go, for instance, cleaning up after a patient who has the coronavirus, and then they get sick, well, that might be an injury by accident. Her new job duties, the fact that she didn't have to do that ordinarily, that might be something unusual. That's the accident. That's what's going to distinguish from just being sick in itself. The hard part about proving someone's sickness from COVID-19 is, covered under the Workers' Comp Act, is providing that the virus was directly caused by the exposure. And that's really going to be hard because, of course, that's the reason why this is a pandemic, is that it's so contagious. It is so, it can be contracted just about anywhere. So that can be really hard. I'm not saying that this isn't a plausible way for someone to recover, under the Workers' Comp Act for contracting the virus, this injury by accident standard, but it's just going to be really hard to prove. But some situations, I guess that, for instance, this hospital clerk, that could possibly be it, as long as you could prove that the virus was in fact contracted from that one specific instance. But for a lot of folks, proving that the coronavirus, their infection from it, should be covered under the Workers' Comp Act is really going to entail proving this occupational disease, right? And remember what I said earlier. The rule is that an occupational disease has to be in either a condition listed in that statute, those 28 diseases, and COVID-19 is not there, or it has to be a condition which someone's job was a significant contributor in contracting the disease, and the employment placed them at an increased risk of getting it over the general public, okay? So in terms of addressing significant contribution, again, that's absolutely going to mean someone can show that they're getting sick from the virus almost surely came from the job. And they didn't get it from a family member at home. They didn't get it because they went to like a large family gathering and, got it from, over the holidays. It was an exposure from work, from probably someone who had the virus. And, this is going to be a high bar, but not impossible if someone can show that they went to work and home and weren't exposed anywhere else. And, I have had calls with folks, and even, experiences with my own family members who have high risk jobs and go get sick, go home. No one else at home has the virus. In fact, no one else gets the virus. And, you can conceive that that was, in fact, where they got it, if that's really all the interaction that they were having with, possibly getting the virus. So in terms of showing that someone's employment placed them at an increased risk over the general public, that's going to be hard because of how contagious this virus is. But there is some guidance from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration at the federal level. And I was printing it off. It was actually, let me see, it was actually like a guide that they were putting out on preparedness at work. And it was the Preparing Workplaces for COVID-19 publication online. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA for short, says very high exposure risk professions include professions like healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, dentists, paramedics, EMTs, healthcare or laboratory personnel collecting and handling specimens of COVID-19, morgue workers performing autopsies. It also includes staff that have to enter patients' rooms, medical transport workers like ambulance drivers, mortuary workers. And apart from OSHA, there's been a movement, in states like Kentucky and Washington in particular, where laws have been passed to cover first responders, healthcare workers, workers in essential services who, end up getting the virus. In North Carolina, there had been a House bill that had been introduced, but it doesn't sound like it wasn't passed, unfortunately, that they attempted to create sort of like this rebuttable presumption where first responders, healthcare workers, workers in essential services who contracted the virus, there was a presumption they got it from the job. And then the point of all this is that there's a recognition by the state, a recognition at the federal level, a recognition in other states that there are certain professions that expose someone or place them at an increased risk on the job from getting, coronavirus, the getting sick. And this includes healthcare workers for sure, but there are good arguments for nursing home workers, law enforcement, firefighters, other first responders, and the conditions in these jobs. I think there's good arguments that the conditions in these jobs result in hazards, which distinguishes them in character from the general run of occupations and certainly the general public. Make sure I didn't miss the comment. So for example, if there's a paramedic who responds to a nursing home where two people are sick, they've got high fevers, and then he ends up or she ends up getting the virus and ends up being in the hospital. There's a pretty good argument that that particular paramedic, given by virtue of their job, assuming that they can prove the exposure that they had to those two patients was COVID-19 and that's where they got it, there's a pretty good argument that their employment placed them at an increased risk. So that's just an example. That's the kind of job that's going to meet this test for an occupational disease and coverage under the Workers' Comp Act. So what benefits are payable if you're COVID-19, you get COVID-19 and it's covered under the Workers' Comp Act? So for instance, compensation for time out of work, most cases, fortunately, are going to be mild. Hopefully they won't be longer than 14 days. But some folks are going to be out for longer than that. Some folks are going to be out for, months in the hospital. So that lost income, even if it's only 2/3 of what they were earning, is going to mean something. Medical treatment is going to be covered, of course. Again, it could be minor for a mild case, but then it can go from hundreds of thousands of dollars from being in the hospital, and spending weeks, on a ventilator, in some cases. And then there's compensation for permanent damage to, important body organs like lungs, or, if you have a permanent condition from, complications that come from COVID, which we're seeing and learning more about every, as the months and weeks go on from this, horrible disease. So tip of the week, we talked about this last week too, but this is a very fact-specific inquiry when it comes to figuring out whether COVID-19 is covered under the Workers' Compensation Act. And taking notes, I'm not saying you necessarily have to be, like these track finders who have to figure out everywhere you've been, but yeah, you're going to have to know just about everywhere you've been, could have potentially have been exposed is going to be really important. And even when you have that information, just like every occupational disease, it is going to be so important to speak to a board-certified workers' compensation specialist. These are cases, it's a novel virus, it's a novel workers' comp case, and it's going to be worthwhile to speak to somebody who has has that exposure to workers' comp law and more than a general basis, and a workers' compensation specialist will definitely have that. So that is, in a nutshell, in a little bit more than 20 minutes, how the Workers' Compensation Act will, theoretically apply to COVID-19 and infections. It is something that, we're still learning a lot about because it's not even been a year, although it feels a lot longer. But that's all for today on today's episode of Workers' Comp Talk. This is Jennifer Signieri with Johnson & Groniger. I'll see you next time. Please bring your questions and be safe.